Good morning and welcome. It's my pleasure to begin this interesting weekend. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Brumberg, who will be speaking about Islam and democracy in the Middle East. Dr. Brumberg is an associate professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's also senior advisor to the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, where he focuses on issues of democratization and political reform in the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. Previously, he was a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he pursued a study of power sharing in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He has taught in the past at Emory University and the University of Chicago. Dr. Brumberg is the author of many articles on political and social change in the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. And his book, Reinventing Khomeini, The Struggle for Reform in Iran, was published in April 2001 by the University of Chicago Press. He lived and studied in Egypt for 3 years and has conducted field research in Iran, Indonesia, and Kuwait. He told me in our email exchange that he plans to cover the upcoming Egyptian elections, so we can stay tuned to what might come from that. He received his bachelor's from Indiana University and a PhD from the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brumberg.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's going to be rather a quick visit for me because I have to, unfortunately, get back to D.C. this morning. I, several years ago, enrolled my son in a Jewish school, and he's taking this Judaism stuff very seriously, which is really not the whole point of my sending him there in the first place. I just didn't have any decent schools in my neighborhood in D.C., and I thought, well, I'll see how this works. And suddenly he asked me to build a sukkah and all this stuff. So we built one. Actually, my wife built it, and she's expecting my return pretty soon. The timing is a bit awkward in that regard, so I wish I could be with you here longer, but that's the way it is right now. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to speak to audience of secondary school teachers. I come from a family of teachers. My late mother was a first grade teacher in the DC area. My sister taught first, second, and third grade here in Philadelphia for many years. I am a teacher, of course. I sometimes prefer first graders over my college students, but that's a different matter. But in any case, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to provide Islam and democracy is a huge subject, obviously, and I'm going to try to provide some ideas which I think are going to be hopefully analytically useful for your own teaching purposes. I think it's important, and I'm sure you share my perspective on this, never to talk down to our students and always assume that they can approach these issues from a higher level. And the challenge, of course, when it comes to the contentious issue of Islam and politics is to pursue this subject in a way that's objective, that's shorn of as much dogma as we possibly can. So I'm going to try to offer you some ideas about how I view the subject that I think will hopefully will be useful. And to start off, I have really several points. I'm going to first talk about the upcoming elections, not in Egypt, but actually in Tunisia. They're coming up on the 23rd of October. Tunisia, whose rebellion really sparked the Arab Spring, as it's been sometimes referred to, is going to hold elections for the creation of a constituent assembly this month. And the assembly will have 1 year to come up with a new constitution for a democratic Tunisia. I happen to believe that of all the cases attached to this concept of Arab Spring, that Tunisia is the one place where there is greatest hope for some sort of transition to democracy. I am far less optimistic about Egypt. I am pessimistic about Syria and Yemen and Libya. Well, that's an open book for me, and in many respects an unknown book because I haven't really pursued work on Libya. So. But I want to say something about Tunisia, then I want to turn to the whole question of Islam as religion, Islam or ideology, or Islamism or ideology. Then I want to look a little bit more into this question of Islamic ideology versus Islamic traditionalism. I'll unpack those concepts when we get there. And then, number 4, Islam in political context. Islam is not the problem, the challenge is politics. And finally, a brief discussion of the Arab Spring, all that. And how much time do I have? About 45 minutes? Whoa, boy. So I'm going to get going right away. Well, the Tunisian elections. I spent a week recently in Tunisia, a country that I had never visited, in part because under the previous regime, somebody who worked on issues of democracy and political change in the Middle East, as I do, was not welcome in Tunisia, and if you arrived there, you couldn't do any work anyway, so I never went. But of course, things had changed when Ben Ali fled the country and Tunisia embarked on its transition. Tunisia was an authoritarian state which practiced what I call good old protection politics. And what I mean by the protection state or the protection racket state is that Ben Ali's rule was based not simply on coercion, on the secret police and so on imposing himself. It was also based, as so many leaders in the Middle East do, on providing certain constituencies with the protection of the authoritarian state from other constituencies. And here, of course, what I'm thinking about is the middle class, professional business bourgeoisie of Tunis, of the coast, that was provided economic and social and political protection under the rubric of an authoritarian state. Protection from whom? Of course, from the Islamists. The issue of Islam and democracy, the secular Islamist debate in Tunisia, is not really, or merely, as is often the case, a debate about religion and politics or the relationship between mosque and state. It's also a debate about where Indonesia fits in terms of the whole world and what Tunisian identity means. For Islamists, Tunisia is a Muslim country first and foremost, an Arabic-speaking country that's part of the Muslim world, and only secondarily part of Europe and the rest of it. For the secular business and professional class of Tunisia, schooled often in France, Tunisia is first and foremost a Tunisian Mediterranean Western country where French is an important, if not the language, whose fate and future is tied up with the relationship between the West and not the Muslim world. And these are very polarized perspectives. Of course, there are a lot of people who meet in the middle of these perspectives, but that is the divide, and it tends to accentuate the divide, only because it's not merely, again, a question of religion and politics, but really a civilizational and identity issue. And what the authoritarian state did in Tunisia very well is play on the fear of the secularists, of the Islamists, insisting that, well, you may not like the way we operate our state here. It's a coercive state Ben Ali ran, but it's better than the alternative, which is an Islamist regime which will persecute you. And just look over at our neighbors there at Algeria, what happened in 1991-92. The Islamic Salvation Front, otherwise known as the FIS, nearly took power. The FIS promised to pursue, if not persecute, the non-Islamist or secular elite that had helped create the modern state of Algeria. That's what happened over here. We can't afford that sort of thing. Look what happened in Iran when we had an Islamic revolution. Here we are. Stick with us, and this is a better alternative. The devil you know is better than the devil you really don't know or you don't want to know. And of course, this is precisely the rationale that Ben Ali used also towards the United States and France, arguing, well, you support me because the alternative is much worse. It's a form of authoritarianism which will be unattractive to your own interests and in many respects worse. And so that sort of protection racket politics ran pretty well for a number of years. I think it's important to recognize that authoritarian states, again, to repeat what I said before, have constituencies who have economic, social, ideological interests in maintaining the status quo. And until those constituencies are presented with what they perceive is a better alternative or become sick of the present alternative, the status quo, those constituencies will continue to at least tacitly support these authoritarian states. And what we've seen in Tunisia over the last few years is an erosion of support within the constituency that helped to support Ben Ali for his state. And in addition, the rise of a new generation of young people, particularly in the rural areas. If you visit Tunisia, if you go to Tunis, Tunis is one city, modern. It reminded me in so many respects of Malaysia, tall buildings, banks, and the rest of it. As soon as you leave Tunis and you go into the countryside, you're in rural Tunisia, a different world. And the rebellion in Tunisia began in the countryside and came to the urban areas. I think that's very important, a generation of young people who were lost and had no role in this new Tunisia and got fed up, particularly with the dehumanizing nature of the police state that Ben Ali had created. So when this revolution came to the capital, suddenly the Tunisian middle class rose up itself, joined the bandwagon, and helped to bring Ben Ali down. And the question for Tunis now is whether you can go from an authoritarian protection racket to a democratic protection racket. And what I mean by that is the concerns of the secularists remain very potent. They are very concerned that the leading Islamic party, the Nahda party, will use the instruments of democracy and the franchise of the vote itself to impose a new form of authoritarianism on the secular plurality, minority or more likely plurality. They know that Nahda, as almost always is the case with Islamist parties in the Middle East, is far better organized than the secular parties, particularly since the ruling party itself, the RCD, has collapsed more or less. And when I was in Tunis, I gave a lecture at a center run by a colleague, a Tunisian-American colleague of mine, to a group of largely Islamists, kind of middle-class, moderate Islamists, in which I made the case that the only way for Tunisia to make the transition was to do two things. First of all, to recognize that in order to have some sort of political consensus, elements of the old regime had to be brought into that consensus, that you simply can't exclude the former voices of the previous regime whole cloth, because if you do that pragmatically, of course, many will revolt against the new democracy. Take Iraq as an example of what happens when you exclude a major community from the new democracy, or you try to do so. And philosophically, exclusion is not exactly democratic. So you want to bring in the old party, but you also want to make sure, and this is the crucial point, that Islamists and secularists can come to some sort of political pact, consensus, agreement, stating the name of the game, setting out the rules of democracy, and providing assurances, particularly to those groups which have the most to fear from the transition, i.e. the non-Islamist secular groups, that in the process of building a new democracy, there will be constitutional, electoral, and other guarantees that will assure that the majority does not impose a unwanted agenda on the minority or on a significant plurality of the community. And that's what's going on in Tunisia right now. I think the good news there is that Nahda recognizes, at least it seems so thus far, that it has to address the concerns and the fears, and this is what really people talk about, the fears, les craintes in French, of the secular elite, and provide guarantees. And thus far we've had an agreement on the shape and role of the Constituent Assembly among 10 different parties, which is quite reassuring. There's nothing like that in the case of Egypt, certainly in the case of Yemen so far, although Yemen's quasi-authoritarian state was based, interestingly enough, on the role in part of an organized opposition coalition that did bring Islamists and secularists together. But I have an illustrious colleague who will be here later talking to you about the case of Yemen, so I won't go there too much. But in any case, Tunisia is this interesting case of a state where the Islamists and secularists are trying to come together and talk to one another despite all these fears and concerns, which is quite remarkable because prior to the collapse of the regime, there was no such dialogue at all. This sort of dialogue and this sort of consensus building, this sort of pact making requires enormous political leadership. And from what the little I could tell when I was in Tunisia, there's also a dearth of good leaders. So that thus far, everybody is behaving in a rational way and and proceeding to have some sort of basis of consensus is encouraging. So I think that's the challenge in all the countries we're talking about, and that is how to shift from the old protection racket game to a democratic protection racket in which the rules of democracy protect the fundamental rights and interests of all groups. I'm not suggesting that the protection racket I just displayed for you a moment ago involving Islamists and secularists is replicated exactly throughout the Middle East. It differs from place to place to some extent. For example, we know very well in the case of Syria that the Alawite minority regime provided protection through authoritarian dictate and through authoritarian instruments to the Alawite community and to the Christian community as well, and that the majority Muslim community was not completely shut out. Bashar al-Assad and his father had a implicit understanding with the business community. The business community was allowed to pursue business in return for its support of the regime. I guess that's a form of protection as well. But now the big question in Syria is whether in making the transition to any kind of post-authoritarian state, you can address the fears of the minority community. And of course, Assad and his allies in the Alawite community have every intention of making sure that doesn't happen by playing up and exaggerating, magnifying, or otherwise manipulating fears of Islamist radical domination over the Alawite and Christian communities. In Egypt, the Islamist secular debate is a very serious debate. The minority Coptic community, which makes up about 12% of the population, is afraid of any post-Mubarak regime. We've already seen in the last few months the departure of 100,000 Copts from Egypt. It is predicted that another 100,000 will leave soon. There is great concern. And of course, the Coptic community was protected by the military under the Mubarak regime and now fears that it's going to lose that protection. At the same time, greatly resents the actions of the military, which seems to be cozying up to the Islamists, which is, as I'll talk about a little later, an effort of the Egyptian military to reinvent the protection racket in a quasi-democratic context. So, in trying to understand all these dynamics, I think it's important to distinguish between Islam as a religion, Islamism as an ideology, and finally the political context in which Islamism as an organized ideology evolves. I think I make these points because I think they are useful analytically in a general sense, but I also think they are useful particularly for you in terms of working with your students on this difficult subject, how to organize a subject and how to sort of teach it. I think we'll have to recognize that Islam as a religion is a complex religious tradition, which differs in many respects from Islamism as an ideology. Islam as a religion never made a coherent argument for a full-fledged, comprehensive Islamic ideology that was to be applied to each and every aspect of our daily lives. Islamic traditionalism, in fact, while making a claim that Islam had to be reflected in public life and making the claim that the leaders of an Islamic state or a Muslim community had to protect Sharia, Islamic law, and had to protect basic Islamic traditions, never made a full-fledged argument for what we would call an Islamic ideology. The very notion of an Islamic ideology is paradoxical because the advocates of what we might call Islamist ideology have tended to be non-clerical, quasi-secular political operators and entrepreneurs and leaders, lay Islamist leaders, who went to Islam and tried to sort of fashion from various elements of Islam a coherent political ideology that in some respects would echo the ideologies of the West. A great example of that sort of instrumentalization of Islamic tradition, Islamic thought, was Jamil Afghani, one of the preeminent leaders in the 19th century of the Islamic revivalist tradition. Afghani is often described as a, quote, fundamentalist, but we know from ample studies that Afghani was largely secular and viewed Islam not so much as a given truth that had to be obeyed because it was demanded by God, but Islam as an ideology and a religious tradition that was important to the masses that had to be repackaged, redefined in order to respond to British imperialism. And Afghani, therefore, was very instrumental in sort of putting together an Islamic ideology which he thought could speak to the masses on the one level, and then at the same time be used and manipulated and directed at the British on the other, all in the name of a political struggle. And that's really what defines or separates Islamic tradition, which is a multivocal, complex tradition, from Islamism as a political ideology. And the paradox that I alluded to a few minutes ago is, of course, that Islamist ideology is often proffered in the name of cultural and religious authenticity as something opposed to the West. And it, of course, has been used to oppose the West. But Islamic ideology, to the extent that it is based on the concept of a coherent and comprehensive ideology, mimics the West. In some sense emulates the Western tradition. And it's always had that sort of aspect to it. Modern day Islamists are not, as I mentioned before, usually clerics. They are not part of the clerical establishment. They are usually engineers, political leaders, professionals of different kind, journalists, intellectuals, and they have embraced various forms of Islamist ideology for political purposes. They do so often in opposition to the clerical establishment, because in much of the Arab world, including, by the way, Syria, the clerical establishment has been co-opted by authoritarian states, and as a consequence of that, the clerical establishment has been deemed by these Islamist political activists as illegitimate because they've sold out to these authoritarian states. So the Islamist tradition is very much a lay tradition, and is based on the emergence and within the folds of a kind of incipient middle class, professional middle class. That middle class has always faced, and the Islamist political tradition has always faced a number of difficult challenges purely on the theoretical basis. On the Sunni Islamist ideology faces a small but crucial contradiction or tension. That is to say, that the Sunni Islamic tradition has no equivalent of the Catholic Church with a hierarchy of clerics who speak in God's name and to whom we attribute some sort of infallibility, such as the Pope, of course. In Sunni Islam, there is no organized church, as it were. There is no theoretical basis to create such organization in traditional Sunni Islam. At the same time, Sunni Islam does claim that somehow the body politic must reflect Islamic traditions, but there's no theory about how to do this. There's no clear path to making this happen, and as a consequence, nor is there a clear hierarchical leadership, as there is, let's say, in Shiite Islam, about which I can talk later, to sort of provide the guidance as to how to build an Islamic state. And so Islamist leaders have been, for 2 centuries now, rebelling against authoritarian states or states which have co-opted the clergy, claiming that these clerics are illegitimate because they have not enforced Islamic rule, because they are simply the mandarins of their states. But it's not easy, and nor has it been. It's been a challenge for Islamists to come up with their solution as to how Islam is supposed to provide a basis for a modern political state, and that means huge fragmentation, often within the movements of Islamism, as to how you go about this, because there's no consensus. From the point of view of the secularists, that fragmentation, of course, is a good thing. So I think you have to distinguish when you're teaching Islam between Islamic traditions, ideas, and so on, and Islamism as an ideology. It is interesting to note that that theoretical distinction is also reflected, as I was alluding to, in terms of political practice. We see in the Arab world that Islamism as an ideology is prevalent, and if not dominating, in almost every state in the region. If you turn around and go to the opposite end of the world and you go to Indonesia, you will find that you have various parties that are Muslim parties, but which reject an Islamist agenda. In other words, Muslim parties that have a traditional base, that whose leaders, some of whom are clerics, Nahdlatul Ulama, otherwise known as NU in Indonesia, a massive, not a political party, but a massive social movement that created parties, always rejected the notion of an Islamic state per se, an Islamist agenda. So Indonesia, you have a few minority Islamist parties, and you have Muslim parties at the same time that differ about how the role of Islam in the state, and often reject quite explicitly the Islamist agenda. So it's a complicated terrain we're looking at. But what is notable about the Arab world, if I may put it in these terms, is the prevalence of Islamist parties and the weakness of Muslim parties, if you can make that distinction. And I think that remains a problem for democracy itself. Now, the fourth point I'd like to make here, and I think is useful, and I've already alluded to this before, is the political context in which Islamists operate. I, some years ago, published an article in the Washington Quarterly entitled "Islam is not the problem or the solution," in which I argued that the problem in the Arab world in particular, in terms of Islam and democracy, was not so much the question of Islam or even Islamism as an ideology, but was a challenge of political context in the organization of states and the way states articulated interests. And I elaborated this idea of Islamism and the Islamic and the Arab protection state in that article, arguing that ultimately the challenge for the region was to reorganize politics in a way that provided incentives for Islamists and non-Islamists, or Islamists and secularists, to exit from authoritarianism and find some other political future by building that future in a more collaborative way. And at the United States Institute of Peace, where I work, I have 2 part-time jobs, each of which I give 80% of my day. And we have sponsored at the United States Institute of Peace over the years, in Egypt as well, dialogues between Islamists and secularists, because we believed, and I argued, both in terms of practice and theory, that the only way to break the protection racket politics of these states was to get Islamists and secularists together to talk about a different kind of future, and to get each one of them to back away from the protection state. And the protection racket state has 2 main variants in the Middle East. One is a state that I have referred to as liberalized autocracy. It's the prevalent model in the Middle East. Liberalized autocracy is a model of authoritarianism in which authoritarian states allow a certain measure of state-managed pluralism, elections, open newspapers, competition of different kinds, the growth of NGOs in particular, all of which occur under the rubric of an authoritarian state, which defines certain ambiguous red lines for dissent, but at the same time allows a certain degree of political openness. The purpose, of course, in allowing a certain degree of political openness is to, first of all, allow the state to identify its enemies. The late Anwar Sadat of Egypt used to say that he liked democracy because it gave him the opportunity to identify his enemies. He said so publicly. And Nasser, of course, used, his predecessor Nasser used the opening in 1954 in Egypt, let a 1,000 flowers bloom, as it were, to identify his enemies and then put them all in prison. So liberalized autocracy is a smart model because it gives the state intelligence about who might be opposing it. But it is also a useful model for the liberalized authoritarian leader to play a game of divide and rule, by which the opposition is allowed to proliferate in different bits and pieces, but never coalesce. And of course, in order to sustain that sort of political game, it's very useful to promote both Islamists and secularists. And the liberalized autocratic state has been very adept at funneling support of different kinds to both Islamist groups and non-Islamist groups. For all the talk of how opposed the former president of Egypt, Mubarak, was to Islamism, the state did a very good job of promoting Islamism, and did so in the effort to intimidate non-Islamist secular groups. And this sort of protection racket, therefore, depended on the capacity of the political leader to manipulate pluralism as a strategy of intimidating one group against the other. And so at any point in time, if you looked at the history of Egypt over the last 10 or 15 years, there'd be a moment where the Islamist state was playing, or the Mubarak state was playing the Islamist card, and then the secular card. It's a very cynical game, of course, but very effective in keeping your opposition off balance and divided, and it's precisely why, as I said before, in the case of Egypt, we worked hard to, at USIP, and other groups have done the same, to create a kind of dialogue between young Islamists and young secularists. I'm not claiming that the rebellion that took place in the last few months was a consequence of these modest efforts, but I think those sort of efforts really reflected the kinds of things that have to be done, not only to undermine authoritarianism, but more importantly, to advance a democratic game in the wake of Mubarak's fall. That kind of dialogue, however, doesn't seem to be happening in the case of Egypt very much right now. So we have the liberalized autocratic model, and one finds variations of that model in Egypt and in Morocco. It's beautifully played in Morocco, and in Jordan, and in Yemen, and certainly in Kuwait, in Qatar. It's the prevalent model. After Bush made his speech on promoting democracy in the Arab world, the freedom agenda, the club of liberalized autocracies began to expand even more because everybody wanted to demonstrate they were democratizing. The great thing about liberalized autocracy is that it not only allows you to pretend you're democratizing at home, but you can tell your friends in Washington you're doing the same thing as well. And it looks pretty good from over here because, you know, the state, you can go around Egypt as I did for years, and there's a fair amount of political freedom and debate that takes place. The liberalized autocracy model contrasts with what I call full autocracy. And full autocracy is a model in which there's simply no pluralism at all. The state completely imposes itself on the opposition and doesn't allow for even the smallest degree of state-controlled pluralism to take place in society. Liberalized autocracy is the dominant model, but one knows very well that full autocracy also has its models in the region. Ben Ali's Tunisia was an example of full autocracy. Syria was another example of full autocracy. I think Iraq under Saddam Hussein was another one. And to some extent, although I have to qualify this in the discussion, Iran may also be said to be something like this, although I think Iran is a unique case that doesn't quite fit into these models. I can talk about that. And full autocracies also play, as I said before, the protection racket game in a very brutal and direct way by playing on the fears of minority groups, but at the same time not allowing any degree of any measure of state-managed pluralism whatsoever. Saddam Hussein played on the fears of the Sunni minority, that they would be taken over by the Shia majority. Syria's leaders, the Alawites, as I said before, played on the fears of the Christians and the Alawites of Sunni domination. Ben Ali's played on the fears of the Sunni secular community, of Sunni Islamist domination, but provided no basis for any kind of political contestation whatsoever. In all these cases, the question of how to sort of manage those fears, of course, was never addressed. Liberalized autocracy provides a kind of arena for some measure of debate and discussion, but it's mostly a kind of political ceasefire between sides. Everybody's allowed to participate in elections. Everybody gets some sort of measure of representation in Parliament, but Parliament has no real power. So there's really no incentive for any kind of pact-making or political accommodation, because the instruments of liberalized autocracy are there just to create a kind of political ceasefire and not a real incentive for accommodation. And a full autocracy, of course, provides no basis for even the slightest degree of communication between these two sides. So in both cases, the collapse of whether it's liberalized autocracy or full autocracy creates a new situation in which the challenge is to build forms of consensus that did not exist before. It's interesting in this case, and here's my fifth point in terms of looking at the Arab Spring, it's interesting in this case to keep in mind that we have a diversity of experiences in the region. It's very difficult to generalize about what's going on in terms of the so-called Arab Spring. That's in part because the nature of the state that preceded the collapse or shaking up of these authoritarian regimes differed considerably. The nature of the protection racket enforced by these states differed considerably as well. And as a consequence, each particular legacy that you find in each country has created a different framework for transitions and created a different map of constraints and opportunities, to use the political science terminology, for the transition. So let's just take a quick look at a few of the cases that are occurring, and I'm going to focus here largely on the cases of Egypt and Tunisia because I think they're very useful cases, particularly in terms of the Islamic secular democracy debate. In Egypt, we have a case of a transition that is largely being presided over by a very powerful military and security apparatus, not simply powerful in terms of its numbers and its role in this, its military role in the state, but powerful in terms of the military's role in the economy of Egypt, which is very significant. The military has a very strong foothold in the production of all kinds of goods and services and doesn't want to give them up, and therefore has good reason to try to preside over the transition and engineer a post-Mubarak regime that secures the interests of the military and does not provide an avenue of major social and political revolution for the opposition. Egypt's opposition likes to talk about what happened in Egypt as a revolution, but it is not a revolution at all so far. It's not even sure that Egypt is what we can call a pacted democracy by any stretch of the imagination, a new democracy that comes together as a result of a political pact engineered and negotiated by the major players. Thus far, this has been a transition presided over by a military that's been very adept at keeping secularists and Islamists and various groups fragmented and off balance in ways that have played upon the fears of all these groups, particularly the secularists, by effectively cozying up to the Muslim Brethren, the Ikhwan Muslimin, and using that cozying process as a kind of hammer to hit the secular groups on the head with. And thus, as a result, the groups that congregated in Tahrir Square and brought about the revolution have been isolated and out-organized and frustrated because they find themselves facing an implicit coalition between the military, the Muslim Brethren, and elements of the former ruling party, all of which are regrouping under the rubric or umbrella of the military in ways that will limit very much the nature of the transition that will take place. The result will probably be a quasi-democratic regime of a new kind, a kind of evolution of liberalized autocracy, short of democracy, but one in which the Muslim Brethren will be playing a much greater role, a much more prominent and organized role than ever before. Now that it is a legal political entity allowed by the state, you can be sure that when elections come, and as they will in November or December, that they'll probably get the largest share of the vote. And once they do so, the military will use that reality, or that which it helped to create, of course, as a hammer to bludgeon its opposition and argue that it has to remain on the political scene in order to protect the rights of all the community. Very cynical sort of assertion, but I think that's going to be the outcome. Tunisia, I talked about that in the beginning of the lecture. The Tunisian Nakhta Party has explicitly adopted the model of the AK Party in Turkey. The AK Party in Turkey is a Islamist, or what it likes to call a post-Islamist party, which argues that that religion has to be part of the underlying value system of the political democracy, but doesn't have to be the legal basis of an Islamist state. That sort of ideology, which views Islam as an important source of spiritual guidance for the community, but at the same time demands a political apparatus that is, to some extent, distanced from religion, is inspired by the American tradition, in part. And Islamists who are trying to invent a new kind of Islamism that is more pluralistic, more secular, often refer to the American experience, in which the distancing of church and state is enacted by the state not to get rid of religion, but to protect it. And that sort of quasi-Islamist secularism, if you like, is held up in contrast to the French tradition of laïcité, in which the state adopts an ideology that is explicitly opposed to and antithetical to religious values. This is more or less the sort of approach of the AK Party in Tunisia. There's a lot of talk in the region about adopting that model among Islamist parties. That is what you hear from the Nakhta Party in Tunis now. When Erbakan came from Turkey to Tunis, I was there at the time. The flags of Turkey and Tunisia are very similar. They were juxtaposed one next to the other on placards and posters throughout the city. And Nakhta Party explicitly referred to the AK Party model in Turkey as its guiding model, or a variation of which it wanted to adopt in Tunis. And when it released its 368-point platform when I was there, the Nakhta Party's platform was conspicuous by the absence of much reference to religion at all. Now, is this sincere or not? I mean, the secularists really worry about this. They say that the Islamists in Tunisia engage in a double langage, a double language, in which they speak to their own constituencies in a more harder fundamentalist language, and when they speak to the secular intelligentsia in a more liberal language. And they see this as a shell game that the Nakhta Party is simply using to advance its agenda of political power. And as a consequence, it says that when the Nakhta Party looks to Turkey as a new model for Islamism, it's simply doing the same thing. That is, trying to assuage the fears of the secularists while at the same time holding back. And as soon as they get power, they'll move in a more fundamentalist direction, quote unquote. Well, we'll see about that. I have my doubts. I think that the Nakhta Party is very much recognizes the consequences of that kind of duplicitous behavior, and is going to probably try to avoid it. And the other good news, of course, is that while the Nakhta Party may gain 35 or 40% of the vote, other parties will also enter the political field, and as a consequence, the Islamist Nakhta Party will be forced to negotiate and perhaps create a multi-party government. Ultimately, from my perspective, what counts is not whether an Islamist party is liberal or democratic or whatever, but whether it exists in a context of competition such that it's compelled to negotiate and compromise and moderate its policies. In the absence of competition, we have the perspective of a much more radical Islamist party. So the issue is not so much the intrinsic nature of Islamism per se, but the context, presence or absence of relatively organized groups that can provide some context of negotiation and limit the aspirations or designs of the more radical members of an Islamist party. Syria, well, there you can't be very optimistic at all, because what's going on right now is the transformation of a peaceful opposition movement into a more radicalized military and sectarian opposition. This has been brought about by the regime. Of course, it complains about it, but its own policies have invited the radicalization, the militarization of the opposition. And that portends two things. First of all, the militarization of the opposition will probably take place under the domination of much more radical Islamist parties of the Al-Qaeda variety. That will result in, of course, possibility of a bloody civil war, and that's what worries me most. In the context of such civil wars, it's very hard to create the basis for political accommodation, at least until the parties have exhausted themselves in years of bloodshed. So there, one can't be terribly optimistic. Libya, well, Libya is, again, it's a place I don't really know very well, but it's a country of 6 million. Where tribal identities remain strong, but Islamism doesn't have a very strong foundation as a basis of ideology. You have a very large professional middle class which has emerged in Libya over the last few years. The quicker one can bring this period of violent conflict to a conclusion, the better. My colleagues at USAP who know Libya and who have been there in the past few months believe that the political elites on all sides will find some basis for negotiation. I hope that's the case. Yemen, well, Yemen's an interesting example, and I'm sure my colleague Gillian will talk more about Yemen, of a country that was, until some 20 plus years ago, two countries, South and North Yemen. There was a unity agreement in 1990, 91, I can't remember the exact year, which brought the two Yemens together. South Yemen was a secular quasi-socialist republic for some years supported by the Soviets. And, northern Yemen, a more tribal, religious, traditional state run by a dominant single party. That dominant single party mobilized the Islamists constantly to sort of repress the South. And in the lead up to the unity, the Islamists were manipulated by the ruling party in northern Yemen as a kind of weapon to beat up the secular South Yemen Republic. Once that was successful and there was a so-called unity agreement, what happened was that the dominant party in northern Yemen turned on the Islamists themselves and began to persecute them. So the Islamists broke their coalition with the dominant party and created an opposition coalition with elements from the south. It was the first example, starting in 1994, I believe, or 5, of a united coalition bringing Islamists and secularists together. But the coalition in Yemen was brought together not out of ideological convergence, but because the Islamists and the leaders from South Yemen shared a common enemy, which was the leaders of the ruling apparatus in the north. And so what you had was a kind of political alliance of convenience and not necessarily a coming together of any kind of mutual vision of a new Yemen. And then when the rebellion and the democracy rebellion erupted, the absence of any coherent sort of consensus about an alternative to authoritarianism was manifest in the divisions and violence within the opposition itself. So Yemen remains an open question. Anyway, that's my view. Obviously, it's a very mixed view of the region. If one takes any lesson from what I've said thus far today, that is that it is simplistic to think about the region either as a problem of Islam or even Islamism per se, and that what we have to do is recognize that there are various sets of issues and factors that are really central to the evolution of Islam and democracy. We do know from simple, obvious empirical reality that Islam itself is not responsible for the presence or absence of authoritarianism. Indonesia has 200 million or more citizens, 90% or 95% of whom are Muslims, and Indonesia has a thriving, extraordinary democracy itself. So one has to look beyond the question of religion and pay close attention to the political and social context in which Islam is transformed into an ideology, and those who espouse that ideology, the relationship with non-Islamists and those who are in power, and look at that mix of factors and relationships as the key to trying to unpack the prospects for a democratic Middle East. Thank you very much. We'll take questions. We have 2 people circulating with handheld microphones. I didn't say anything about Iran. I'd be happy to talk more about Iran. In terms of the analytical sort of framework I provided you, Iran doesn't quite fit in, but I'd be happy to answer questions about the Iranian case as well.
I had a quick question about economics and the possibility for democracy. Kwame Nkrumah had a great quote 60 years ago that democracy begins with breakfast. And I know the popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at times has been because it provided simple things like transportation to very poor people. Similarly with Hamas, some of its popularity is in providing social services. So how much of reaching a kind of democratic transition is dependent on coming up with a solution to the problems that the poorest of the poor, which seems to be a huge percentage of the population?
That's a very important question, and that was, I spent many years in Chicago, so that sort of political service industry is something I'm familiar with. We call it clientelism, and there's no question about it that when you want to look at the substructure of Islamist political power, there's the Islamist ideological aspects, but then there is the delivery of services aspect, whether it's providing meat and food or subsidized sugar or more elaborate health services in the context of a state-supported health system which collapses, and as a consequence, middle-class Egyptians are looking for decent health care. They can't afford the private clinics run for the big fat cats. They don't want to go to the public hospitals where you end up dying. And as a consequence, you go to the clinics run by the Islamist parties, which are, of course, subsidized from Saudi Arabia. You may go in there because you have a toothache or something like that. And I'm not saying you've got to come out, an Islamist with a tooth that's healed. But if you keep coming back over time, you might begin to imbibe some of the local ideological lore. In the context of a democratic transition, this is a huge problem for the non-Islamist parties because they simply don't have the mechanisms of clientelism and patronage. These mechanisms in Egypt were operated by two players, Islamists mainly in the urban areas, and the ruling party, the NDP, in the rural areas. And the NDP counted on its huge patronage network in the countryside to mobilize votes. What's going on now is the reinvention of the patronage networks. The Islamist parties are doing very well in the urban areas, and they're trying to extend their patronage into the rural areas. At the same time, there's a lot of rumors about elements of the old ruling party in Egypt reinventing the old patronage networks. How can young, secular minded youth in Egypt who spend their time on Facebook and the rest of it compete with that? They can't. They simply cannot. And so that is a great concern. And do they want to compete with that? Is that the basis of their political mobilization? They say no, that's the old dirty politics. Part of the problem with if I may say so, with the young secular, sort of mostly secular oppositionists that I know in Egypt is that politics is a dirty thing for them. They're social activists. They want to maintain the purity of social activism, which is nice. Meanwhile, everybody else is organizing and they're sitting there being pure, and it's a problem. And part of it is the clientelistic issue. It's a kind of dirty politics, and you can't just get rid of it overnight. So what you have to do is try to organize yourself as best you can. So when you do enter the political fray, first of all, you have hopefully a constitution which provides basic guarantees for rights, and then on that basis, in an election down the road, increase your own constituency, knowing that in the first election you're probably going to get beat up pretty bad. So that's why in the case of both Egypt and Tunisia and in Libya as well, the real crucial battle now will be the creation of new constitutions and constitutional rights. There's a huge struggle over how that process is going to play out in those countries.
My question is about the potential influence in the Arab Spring on the movement towards Palestinian statehood. And do you see, or you just want to get a sense of your opinion on how the Arab Spring movement is impacting the Palestinian-Israeli question?
I thought you were going to ask me about the influence of the Arab Spring on the anti-Wall Street protests of those guys with the tents down the street. I was anticipated, or in Wisconsin, because what was remarkable in the first weeks of the Arab Spring was people running around, in Wisconsin with signs, "We are the Arab Spring," and so on. So our whole universe of reference was turned upside down. What the hell's going on here with, Cairo and Wisconsin and, guys in tents down the street 5 blocks from us here and so on. It's a tremendously difficult question to ask. My feeling has always been very strongly that the persistence of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict, but particularly the Palestinian-Israeli dimension, obviously, of it, was a huge political and ideological diversion in the region. And by diversion, I mean not the usual argument that Arab autocratic states used it to manipulate. Yes. But what we tend to forget is that political elites care deeply about this issue. and it's not something simply invented or manipulated by regimes to get these elites to think about something other than democracy. They actually do care about it. And in the context of global communications, satellite and internet and so on, the conflicts on the West Bank can come into the living room of political middle-class elites in Jakarta in a way that it couldn't 10 years ago. And that means that the issue is even more important in some respects, not less, than it ever was. In the absence of a two-state solution which is viable and credible and sustainable, I think that this issue is going to continue to disrupt the prospects for democratic transition throughout the region, particularly in the countries that are closest to and part of that conflict. In the case of Egypt in particular, a place I know well, obviously lived there and studied there and so on, it has to be remembered that Sadat's peace treaty with Israel was although greeted by the masses, who were of course organized and mobilized to do precisely that, from the perspective of the political elite and the opposition, it was illegitimate, not necessarily because it recognized Israel's right to exist, but because it took place in the context of of the failure to resolve the Palestinian issue and create a Palestinian state. And until we have an operating Palestinian state, it's going to be very hard politically to identify who it is in these political oppositions to the Arab world who oppose Israel because they oppose Israel as a state, or because they oppose Israel because Israel hasn't made peace with the Palestinians. So we need a peace process to help that process of distinguishing motivations to take place. And in the absence of that, the radicals will always have the upper hand in these issues. And I think what we've seen in Egypt only reminds us that the absence of peace between Israel and the Palestinians is very much something that favors radical Islamists and radical Arab nationalists and the regime itself, which is playing upon xenophobia, anti-Americanism, anti-Islamism, and anti-Judaism, because in the last decade or more, perhaps the last 2 decades, Islamism has developed within its own folds an anti-Semitic discourse that is very potent and is increasingly widely shared, and it's been manipulated by Islamists and by regimes as well. And in this process of manipulation, the secularists, the liberals, whoever wants to provide a different sort of foreign policy and a different domestic policy gets squeezed out. The liberals, the secularists, the secular liberals, if you like, are desperate for a peace treaty. They're just desperate for one, because they know that in the absence of resolving the biggest wound in the region, their domestic politics will never stabilize.
Can you state your name and school? Yeah, Jason O'Connor, North Broward Preparatory School. I'm actually from Israel and lived there many years, served in the Israeli military. In light of your projection of pretty much the Muslim Brotherhood becoming the biggest party in Egypt in the upcoming elections, and the radicalization of Turkey, do you project the future war between Turkey, Israel, Egypt, and Israel, as some generals have projected recently in Israeli press?
Yeah, well, I prefer to make predictions after events occur. Opposed to before. It's my usual. My father taught me that a long time ago. On Egypt, I think that, if you have an election that leads to the Ikhwan taking 35 or 40% of the vote or something like that, maybe more, Egypt is going to take a relationship that was already pretty cold and make it colder. I don't think they'll end the peace treaty. Because the military is a business military. It doesn't want war. It doesn't want war. And it was taken out of the Arab-Israeli equation a long time ago. I mean, the option for, the one reason why we saw the rise of Hamas and the rise of Hezbollah and the conflict with Israel is that once you removed Egypt from the equation, a conventional war was no longer an option in the conflict. And I think Egypt will maintain that position and therefore exclude the possibility of a conventional war. Will it rev up the anti-Israeli discourse? Yes. Will it perhaps take its ambassador out or keep it? Yeah, those are all possibilities. But go to war with Israel? No. Allow Palestinian Hamas-related terrorists to infiltrate? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But I don't think there's a chance for a regional war, and I don't think I think the regime is using this as a kind of political prop at home. But mistakes will happen. There's already the question of all this oil in and around Cyprus, and you have Cypriot and Israeli companies digging there and drilling and trying to see what they can find, and the Turkish government has threatened to send their own boats in there, and a mistake can happen, and so on. There's no question about it that that in terms of the overall equation, and I think you had Marty Kramer, addressing these issues that were raised in the beginning here today, that it's much more fragile, and mistakes can happen, and it's unfortunate. My sense is that if Turkey wants to play a constructive role and as a kind of mediator to promote Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli peace, it could do so in ways that would still speak to its base and demonstrate that it's not reneging on the rights of the Palestinians and maintain its Islamist credibility. Instead, I think the leadership is acting in a irresponsible way. I mean, I'm not condoning, by the way, the Israeli attack on the ship going into Gaza inside. That was a huge, if it wasn't a strategic mistake, let's assume, we can agree it was a tactical mistake. But the Turkish leaders seem hell-bent now on pursuing a kind of policy of antagonism without any sort of positive aspects to it. And that is very worrisome. I'm more worried about Turkey than I am about Egypt.
Thank you. Walter McDougall. A sense of nationhood, a nationalism by itself obviously does not guarantee cooperative representative government. We can look at all the European examples of totalitarian states. But it seems to me it would be a truism to say that a sense of common destiny, a sense of, if not nationhood in a European sense, at least a kind of a commonwealth, is a prerequisite to working out the kinds of cooperative post-protection racket politics that you've been describing. And so I look at a place like, well, we've heard all through the occupation of Iraq, we heard about, well, how can you really create an Iraq? It's an artificial country, it needed a dictator to keep it together, blah, blah, blah. Libya, of course, is another perfect example. Libya is a complete artificial construction. After World War II, it's always been Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. And it seems to me it's quite likely to revert to such a division in the future. And you should go around Saudi Arabia and all the rest, all the cliches about the artificial boundaries of that part of the world. And so I guess my query is, could you address the issue of nationhood and nationality within this discussion of the possibilities for democratization? Particularly, would a stable representative or cooperative politics be more possible if some of these countries did split up, as we saw, for instance, in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, two artificial states that ultimately had to crack up in order for their people to achieve stability?
Well, I think that where divorce is possible, particularly if there are no kids, you know how that is. I'm trying to think of the exact analogy in terms of state terms with the kids, but I can't figure that out. But in any case, where that's possible geographically and so on, and the Czech-Slovak solution, it can be an important way to go about it. I mean, Sudan is an example, although my colleagues who are experts at USAP on Sudan, and we're heavily involved in the Sudan, by the way, argue that the real challenge now is for South Sudan's tribes to create a nation. That their nationhood was born of their opposition to the North, and there's huge fragmentation now. And so, states are artificial entities to begin with. I mean, something gets drawn somehow. Of course, Western Europe had the luxury of time and war to create nations and states that somehow fell together. And in some cases, such as Yugoslavia or Belgium, it didn't work so well. So it's nothing unique in that sense, but it is the case that in those countries where there's a greater sense of national identity, in addition to statehood, the prospects for some sort of change, I think, are greater, and that would be true. And to my great surprise, in Tunisia, I had to sort of deal with an interesting paradox. On the one hand, the secular Islamist debate was very strong. At the same time, there was a strong sense of Tunisian identity. which was good. I tried to sort of put those two things together. Happily, it's not a tribal or really sectarian division. It's a kind of ideological division. It's such, where does Quebec fit into Canada kind of question. And that is workable if you have smart leaders and so on, and people don't have lots of guns. That's also useful. Militias make that sort of thing difficult. Morocco is a place, too, where I think there's a greater sense of nation. I do think that, and I've made this argument, although I have colleagues who will contest it, that the transition to some sort of workable solution is easier mostly in monarchies as opposed to presidential regimes, because we have in monarchies you have this mythical kind of arbitrator of the political field who's part of the political apparatus but can claim to stand above it and at a distance from it, and can stand as a kind of national symbol, as the king does in Morocco, for example, as the king does to some extent in Jordan. And in the presidential systems, the president and his apparatus are really implicated in the political apparatus and often come from a particular group, tribe, or sect, and therefore can't possibly provide the institutional basis to arbitrate these kinds of conflicts. So I think that those things do make a difference. But in general, you're absolutely right. I mean, the stronger the sense of nationhood at the outset of the transition, the better you are. In a place like Yemen or Iraq, Libya, Libya's gone, again, I'm quoting the experts here because I'm not an expert in Libya. My colleagues who study Libya, 6 million people, east and west divisions, but over time, a process of moving from rural to urban centers, the emergence of a professional middle class, the creation of a greater sense of Libyan identity that transcended these sort of differences. There's a sense that there's more to work with there than might otherwise be assumed, but I can't really make a judgment of that particular analysis or not.
Wallace Goodman with St. Stephen's in Austin. It seems like you're a little bit pessimistic about the chances for there being, for a good end for the Syrian conflict, but are there policy implications for the United States, or do you think that the Soviet Union's, Russia's recent, change in relations with Syria will be meaningful at all, or is it just kind of a sideshow?
By change in relationship, what do you mean?
Didn't the Russians come out and say that there had to be meaningful reform?
Yeah, well, meaningful reform means, is meaningless right now because this is a regime that's making war against its opposition, and the opposition is getting ready to make war against the regime. And so it's the meaningful reform is what Assad himself said he would provide. And so when the Russians echo that language, they are simply supporting the Syrian regime, not opposing it. And the Russians have used the Security Council and the UN to oppose any kind of stiff sanctions on the. There's a kind of I'm working on this issue with a colleague of mine. There's a kind of implicit coalition of authoritarian states out there: China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, who collaborate to make sure that global norms of democracy are not advanced. And that when oppositions challenge authoritarian regimes, they are beaten down. And I don't think the Russians are doing anything other than effectively supporting the regime in Damascus. As for what we can do, the U.S. is not in a position to do very much. We just had, 2 days ago, a very interesting conference. You can look it up on the USFP webpage, bringing together major voices of the Syrian opposition. You can see it, watch it digitally on the webpage. And I think that the opposition is getting support from various NGOs in the United States, but the administration is not in a position where it can really influence events easily. It's effectively come out in support of the opposition and has had some difficulty saying the words that this regime is no longer legitimate, it must give up power, but effectively it's come in that direction. But there's little the international community can do. The most important player in that regard would be Turkey and Iran, of course. And Iran is supporting the regime out, and the Turkish government has basically effectively come out against the regime in so many words. But unfortunately, Syria has always been an isolated regime, which is done as it will. I think eventually the government's going to come down. I don't think whether it's several months or more I don't think that Assad will eventually survive. The question will be whether in the wake of a civil conflict and a civil war, one can put together a stable, reasonably democratic opposition, or whether the bloodshed will be so fierce that it will preclude that outcome.
Andrew Lee, Pingree School in Massachusetts. Which two particular examples do you think provide the clearest delineation of the difference between liberalized autocracy and full autocracy for high school students to understand?
Egypt and Syria, or Kuwait and Syria. Egypt had a parliament, had a press that was pretty open. You could say almost anything you like about the regime and get away with it. You wouldn't necessarily get put in prison or die. A kind of pluralism that was not simple. You know, to say it's fake or Potemkin kind of pluralism, I think is wrong, because I think what's important about the kind of pluralism that existed in Egypt and that continues to exist in Morocco and in Kuwait is that it allows opposition actors to find supporters in the state with whom it can dialogue and negotiate and get various things such as patronage and various sorts of services to its particular community. And when those things aren't forthcoming, it can raise various forms of opposition in the opposition press, for example. What has really tended to erode the kind of modus vivendi between states and oppositions in liberalized autocracy was Facebook and other forms of communication that took place outside the sort of usual avenues of implicit accommodation that occurred between these two sides. But I think Egypt and Syria, or Egypt and Iraq under Saddam Hussein, are two excellent examples, or Egypt and Tunisia. You know, Tunisia was a police state. You couldn't breathe a word against Ben Ali without going to prison. And that was not the case in Egypt. There was a widespread debate in Egypt in the years leading up to the fall of the regime about issues of constitutionalism. When I was a student in Egypt in the mid-'80s, I took courses at Cairo University, and there were conferences on democracy and so on, fairly serious events. Well, I'm not aware of one conference in Tunisia in the last 20 years on democracy. It just didn't happen. The liberalized autocracy tends to demonstrate and even need some degree of political autonomy within society. And so the other thing that distinguishes the liberalized autocracy model from others is the proliferation of NGOs in these regimes. And you find them in Morocco and Egypt and Kuwait and Jordan. To some extent, of course, authoritarian regimes benefit from the proliferation of NGOs because the political energy is sapped from parties into a fragmented world of NGO competition. And so you get what looks like a strong civil society, but a weak political society. And you need strong political parties. So these states would rather have 1,000 points of light, to echo a former president of ours, than 2 or 3 strong political parties that can really negotiate with the regime.
Are there any more questions?
Tim Curtis, Avon High School, Avon, Connecticut. Is there any evidence that Iran has tried to influence the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt?
In Egypt, no. Clearly, ideologically speaking, the Iranians, well, first of all, the Iranians claimed the Arab Spring was evidence of an Islamist uprising against the West and the U.S. and Israel and so on. It tried to sort of portray the uprising in language that was that aligned with its own ideological priorities and its own identity as a state. And that was obviously a very calculated manipulation of the Iranian regime to sort of bandwagon with these oppositions, and in the hope that they would produce regimes that are closer to Iran than not, or at least antagonistic to the U.S. In the case of Syria, there is some evidence that the Iranians may have been assisting the regime in quelling the opposition, but I think this is disputable. and certainly that evidence is not available to those of us who don't have security clearances. But Khamenei initially was quite supportive of the regime and of Assad, and said as much. Only recently, in the last few months, have we seen the regime try to distance itself a little bit away from that support. The stronger the opposition, the more the Iranian regime began to play with the idea of distancing itself from supporting Assad. And that was reflected in this call for negotiations and reform and listening to the interests of the people. And of course, the other state that is, unfortunately, to the great surprise of some, supported Assad is the regime in Baghdad. The very political leaders who we helped to put into power and to create a new democracy that would be a light unto other nations, blah, blah, blah. And now we find is supporting, I mean, for reasons of clear political interests. I mean, it's the next door neighbor. There are business interests across the boundaries. Iran, of course, is pressing the Iraqis to take this position. Lots of good reasons to do so, but the fact that you have a democracy or something that looks like the emerging democracy in Iraq that is supporting the repression of a legal opposition movement in Syria is disconcerting, nevertheless.
Dave Barrett from Millington High School. You mentioned the social media aspect and things. Do you believe that with today's instant media and communications and things like that, that it will help or hinder long-term prospects for real deep-rooted change? Maybe like with the Gaza Strip, where you have people there who are really true believers, as opposed to maybe just, this is the crisis of the day, and then next week some other crisis comes along, or some other protest or something goes along, and so it maybe almost creates a vacuum of power with the toppling of a government for someone else to come in and just kind of fill in the slot that was.
Well, those are good questions, and they're hard to answer in the context of, 3 minutes. They're the fodder for a whole couple of days conference. But my simple and simplistic response is that the proliferation of mass media and Facebook and the rest of it is both a good and bad thing. It's good in the sense that it helped to some extent for society to overcome what we call in political science collective action problems, the kind of barriers to creating a degree of political and social and ideological solidarity and cooperation against a common enemy, or against these authoritarian states. And eventually, of course, in the case of Egypt, helped to pull in large numbers of people into the streets, and then you got a cascade of protests that reduced the perceived cost of opposing the regime, and that quickly escalated into a mass opposition. And some of that is the consequence of this creation of a kind of alternative society through the internet, of people talking to one another. And then there was the spark of Tunisia that carried forth into Egypt, and a kind of sudden outpouring of opposition to the regime. But what this media doesn't do is provide a useful substitute for actual nitty-gritty political organizing on the ground, getting people to work together, teaching people how to create organizations, how to mobilize people by knocking on their doors and the rest of it. And when I said both good and bad, the bad we see in Egypt was suddenly this internet generation, this Facebook generation, suddenly turned around and didn't know what to do with its victory, and how to organize, and how to create constituencies, and how to create organizations. They had lived this other existence, this virtual existence of opposition through the internet. They had come up with a certain shared consciousness, if you like, to use a big term. But when it came to sort of translating that into good old grassroots politics, they couldn't compete with the patronage systems of the Ikhwan Muslimin, for example, or the elements of the regime. We talked about that a few minutes ago. So I think that the internet has been a transformative element, but it's also been one that's often sapped the energy away from the other forms of political organization, which are absolutely critical now to succeeding. And when I was in Tunisia a few weeks ago, I saw that up close, because what people were doing in ways that they had never done before in Tunis or Tunisia was actually creating party lists and knocking on doors and having campaigns and kissing babies. I don't know if they were kissing babies, it's a metaphor, you know, and the nitty-gritty of politics. And the secularists or the non-Islamists were scampering to do this and catch up with the Ennahda party, which in effect was ready to do that right away, and much more effectively. So I think the internet has been extraordinarily important, but I also think it has often been a kind of antidote which has been equally problematic particularly for the non-Islamist oppositions trying to find their way to create a new kind of politics.
Thank you. Nathan Johnson, Minnehaha Academy, Minneapolis. As you've explained, the context, the various regional context matters, and there have been different outcomes, certainly different outcomes, Libya, Egypt, and Syria as well. We've had to some extent, democratization in Iraq, maybe Tunisia. You are hopeful that might happen there. Egypt, not so hopeful. Potentially overthrow of the regime in Syria. So are there any long-term implications for places that have been relatively untouched, like Jordan or Kuwait, which may have had some initial protests, but not much has happened there?
Yeah. Well, we talked a little bit about those cases in terms of the monarchies and so on. But it's a very good question. One would hope that the experience, well, of course, if everything goes south and badly, the regimes in those countries will use that experience to make the argument that, well, there's nothing else to do. Look what happened to Libya, or look what happened to Egypt. What you have is far better now than the black hole of democratization. So that will be manipulated and used by these regimes if things really go badly. I mean, I think we can make that prediction. But what if there's a mixed picture? Or what if, particularly in Tunisia, there's some success, or Libya? What if there's a miracle in Egypt? I don't know. One would also hope that regimes and oppositions would learn from that they have to take the issue of reform seriously and not simply as a mechanism of strategic manipulation, short of something that's really real. And that we saw in the wake of events in the Arab Spring some revision of the constitutional makeup of the Moroccan Republic. We saw something a little bit like that in Jordan, but not as much. But it was far from adequate. It was far from adequate. The king of Morocco would have to begin to take seriously the notion of tweaking managed authoritarianism or liberalized autocracy, whatever you want to call it, into something more genuine that provides a real basis for negotiation and representation and consensus building. And it would have to involve, for example, the devolution of his powers in a serious way and not in a kind of half-hearted or way. So one would hope that what would happen would be a signal that, let's get serious about real reforms. Thus far, we don't see a lot of that, unfortunately. And as I said before, if more and more states which have seen rebellions fall into civil conflict and violence, that will certainly be used by ruling autocrats to make the argument that the status quo is preferable to the black hole of true, genuine reform.
Hi, Sam Schindler, Lancaster Country Day School. For high school students, a very broad question, very basic question. You use the word radicalized. Can you just talk a little bit about the radicalization of Turkey? I hear a lot of sort of mixed things about it. And can you just kind of, I know you don't have much time to do it in, but talk about what's going on there politically and what radicalized means?
Well, I don't see I'm not sure, I don't think well, perhaps I did mention the radicalization of Turkey. I don't see a radicalization of Turkey taking place in the sense that the AK Party's politics is not the Islamism of previous parties that were Islamist parties in Turkey. It's a kind of Islamism that tries to evoke certain Islamic norms and principles as a basis for Turkish identity, as opposed to this quasi-secularism of Ataturk. I say quasi-secularism because Ataturk was not out-and-out secularist in any stretch of the imagination. He co-opted the clergy and used Islam to legitimate the state, while at the same time claiming that it was a secular state. So it's a particular experience of so-called secularism under Ataturk. And the Islamism of the AK Party is neither that, nor is it the Islamism of the former, what we might call fundamentalist parties in Turkey. In fact, the AK Party often upholds the American experience as, again, a kind of model for Turkey. And when Erdogan came to Cairo several weeks ago, he chided the Egyptians and said that what Egypt needed was a secular Islamism akin to that of the AK Party in Turkey. I don't know, I wouldn't call that radicalism. I think in terms of Turkey's relationship with Israel, there's been a radical shift. There's no doubt about that. A major break with its strategic partnership with Israel would be a radical shift, for sure. I am, however, worried in Turkey about the fate of pluralism and the way in which the ruling party has used its majority in parliament to wage legal and political war against its critics. This is not a new story. It's been going on for several years now, and the more powerful the party becomes, the more it displays certain authoritarian tendencies that have less to do with Islam per se, and more to do with the desire simply to wage and keep and hold on to power and to intimidate enemies. And it's done so through the press, through the courts. And we like to uphold Turkey as sort of the poster child of liberal democratic Islam for years, and under the Bush administration, a lot of this drift towards authoritarianism was ignored because we needed Turkey to uphold this model. And we've been recognizing, and human rights organizations have been talking about it for quite a while, that this is not what's going on, and that if we're going to be a friend to Turkey, we have to be very clear about our concerns about this drift towards a more hegemonic, authoritarian, democratic kind of politics before it gets too late. So I'm more worried about that than the emergence of an Islamist state in Turkey or anything like that. But we've been talking here about the prospects and dynamics by which Islamist parties do or do not accommodate with the political status quo. Obviously, and what we haven't talked about, but I think for good reason, when we're dealing with groups like Al-Qaeda and groups like that, these are the massively radical, violent organizations that want to topple regimes and use violence against civilians and the rest of it. The Al-Qaeda sort of model obviously has a great deal of sway in certain places, particularly in Afghanistan and to some extent in Pakistan, two cases which we haven't talked about at all today. And particularly the future of Pakistan has got to be concern everyone. But in terms of the Arab world, I think that the allure of that model has been substantially undercut by the rise of the Arab Spring and something that looks like more real politics. And I don't see any Islamist parties at all dancing with the notion of advocating those sort of radical politics. It does have in the region, we see throughout the region, the emergence of what's called Salafi movements. These are what you might call classically fundamentalist Islamist groups, whose vision of the Islamic community is based on the notion of kind of communalism and solidarity that was present in the early years of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. And they present a challenge in Egypt in particular. The Salafis emerged as a strong wing within the Islamist opposition movements. They represent challenges for the main Islamist parties. And they represent a challenge not because they necessarily are hugely popular in terms of numbers, but because the Islamist parties may feel that in order to compete for the popular vote or to maintain their credibility as Islamist parties, they have to echo some of the more radical ideas of the Salafis. And we see occasionally elements of that. It's always a dilemma for these more mainstream Islamist parties to, on the one hand, address the concerns of the broader community and maintain their an ideology of accommodation and dialogue, and at the same time maintain some sort of measure of purity as an Islamist party. And that leads to this phenomenon that I spoke to before of a kind of double language, in which they're speaking different languages to different constituencies while trying to maintain their legitimacy and integrity with all those constituencies. And that's not an easy game to play, and that eventually may, under some cases, undermine their capacity to exercise influence when elections take place. So the emergence of Salafi movements in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere represents a real challenge. But even those movements do not espouse anything akin to the kind of violent ideology of Al-Qaeda and that movement.
We have time for one more question, and I think I'll ask that question. Professor Brumberg, you've mentioned that Indonesia is a thriving democracy, and it is the most populous Muslim country. Does it have the desire or capacity to in any way influence the direction of politics in the Middle East?
No.
Okay.
Next question. You know, there was a time where, in the effort to promote liberal Islam, we were bringing various organizations with which I affiliate and work with. We're bringing various prominent Muslim thinkers from Indonesia to the United States, to conferences on democracy. Abdurrahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, and the first democratic president elected in 1999, was an example. He himself was clearly a kind of liberal Islamic or Muslim thinker, not an Islamist, but a Muslim thinker. He was quite intent on insisting that he was not an Islamist of any kind. And various other compatriots from the intelligentsia of Indonesia came to various conferences, and we brought leaders from the Muslim Brethren, other groups, and they compared notes, and they went home, because Indonesia was Indonesia and the Middle East was the Middle East. And even Indonesia and Malaysia in the same region are vastly different, are very different political systems. And the export of the Indonesian sort of model next door to Malaysia is just simply not in the cards. So I think that it is important to note, however, that the Indonesian experience of trying to maintain a state which protects religious values, and by not getting involved in promoting Islamism as an ideology, to the extent that that kind of secular approach, which as we said before, is very much opposed to the French tradition of laïcité, that secular, quasi-secular, whatever you wish to call it, approach of Indonesia will have greater resonance, particularly in places like such as Tunisia, where that kind of model has been embraced to some extent by the Nahdha party itself. So to the extent that Indonesia is succeeding in that regard, to the extent that Indonesia is a country which remains profoundly Muslim, in which the practice of Islam is a part and parcel of civil society, very much so, that model will succeed and provide some impetus, some encouragement to create a different sort of model. But I've always been sort of wary of the notion that somehow there's this political engineering project we can undergo, whereby we take the leaders there, we put them around a table, and we have a 4-day seminar, and we go home, and somehow this has to evolve historically and on its own pace. Maybe the internet, Facebook, and the rest of it can help to accelerate this process a little bit, but it has to proceed at its own natural pace.
Okay, thank you very much.